Hey everybody, it's Dr. B, and welcome back to Module 3, Advanced Trauma-Informed Care and Resilience Certification course. This is Class 2, Resilience, the Role of Epigenetics in the Trauma Cycle. All right, the objectives for this class are to discuss ACEs, remember those, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and epigenetics. We're going to explain stress bias. We're going to look at primate studies in epigenetics and how genes are expressed in primates epigenetically and make some assumptions about others. And then we're going to talk about continuity of care and what that means in terms of humans. All right, so first let's talk about epigenetics and ACEs. Fetuses who received synthetic cortisol, remember we talked about that in the last class, have demonstrated lifelong hyper-responsiveness on the stress axis. That's sort of like the stress balance beam that reveal greater incidence of hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, and reduced life expectancy. That's what we know about adverse childhood experiences. But this seems to have been an impact on babies that were treated with synthetic cortisol, which is synthetic stress, really, fake stress. So when they're born preemie. So what does that sound like? It sounds like the ACEs study, right? Yeah, it does. It sounds like ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and how they impact people across the lifespan. Additionally, epigenetics and traumas that happen epigenetically can predispose a person for brain-related problems such as anxiety disorders, depression, substance misuse, and even a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Let me share a little bit about schizophrenia in particular. That diagnosis is one that is very confusing because it's activated often by the environment. You're not born with schizophrenia. You're not born with that mental illness. It's something becomes activated epigenetically and that gene then becomes expressed. People are born with the gene potentially, but it's the environment that activates it. Okay, let's talk about stress biasing and do a little activity around this. This is where on a cellular level, the stress genes are encoded really. And that's the epigenetic process that then has a person either having a normal stress response to something in the environment or potentially an extreme stress response to something in the environment. So let's use spiders, for example. Most people have some fear of spiders, and rightly so, because there are many spiders that can hurt you or even sometimes kill you with a bite. So spiders, a normal stress response is to avoid them, to have an avoidance response. And an extreme response would be screaming, crying, running, and being completely hyper responsive to a spider. And that is what that tells us is epigenetically there's been a hypersensitivity in that person and turn the volume up around spiders to high. I happen to be one of those people who have a hyper stress response to spiders, but I know exactly where it came from because I was 5 and I had a really high fever and I hallucinated spiders crawling all over my walls in my parents' bedroom. And so I can't like it. It makes me scared. So, but I can also mediate that fear now as an adult, especially now that I remember where and it's become conscious of where that fear of spiders came from. Now, heights is another one. There are lots of people in the world, and I have 2 of them as children who are afraid of heights. And the normal response to being high up is, avoidance. Like, I'm not climbing the ladder. I'm not going to get on the roof. They're not going to go. They don't want to walk on some bridge over high land. They don't want to do that. Now, an extreme response would be crying, screaming, running away, refusal to go anywhere near something that's high. That's a hyper response. Cotton balls. So a normal stress response to cotton balls would be nothing, would be none, zero. Like, who's afraid of cotton balls, right? Now, interestingly, this is kind of funny too. So 2 of my kiddos do not like heights, but my oldest, who came to me through adoption at the age of 4, had some experience with cotton balls, don't know what it is, but he cannot stand when people rub cotton balls together, because for him, they make a sound or like a texture and a noise that it makes him shimmer. He can't stand it. And so what's the extreme stress response is to avoid cotton balls. And my son actually does avoid cotton balls. He can't stand cotton balls. So, but he's also aware like that is just, a random thing for him. And lots of people have those reactions to certain things. Like, I can't stand touching chalk. I can't stand chalk. I can't stand people writing on a chalkboard or erasing a chalkboard. That gives me the heebie-jeebies for whatever reason. And everybody has these things. But next time you recognize that in yourself, recognize that, oh, that's my hyper stress response in my system that was activated during a certain point in my earliest childhood. All right, we're going to talk about primates now for a minute. And this is a male gorilla. And so many gorillas are raised in captivity by humans. And their socialization skills are not normal because humans are not gorillas. So we don't raise gorillas well because we're not gorillas, and they don't respond to the way we raise babies the same as we don't raise babies the same way that gorillas raise gorillas, even though there are some similarities. So male human-raised gorillas actually grow up to be sexually incompetent and unable to fertilize females. So male gorillas that are raised in captivity by humans are not able to procreate, are not able to have babies. Male gorillas, they don't make great sires because, for one, if they're raised by humans, they can't produce babies. They're not going to make more babies. And when male babies are rejected by their human-raised mothers and have to be raised by humans, then this just perpetuates the process of social inheritance of inept breeding. So we don't have breeding male gorillas in captivity, because if we give a human-raised male baby to a foster mama in captivity, she's going to reject them. Or if a mama in captivity has a baby, then the male baby will often be rejected by the mother and then have to be human raised. And then there's the cycle, that intergenerational cycle of that male baby that was human raised is not capable of breeding. That's all epigenetic. All right, let's talk about the female gorillas for a minute. So female gorilla groups are very, very, very dependent on social engagement and social interaction in order to maintain connection. They're a very social group. So when a female gorilla is raised by humans, they don't have the proper socialization, which then creates inadequate mothers for their babies. So when babies are born and have to be raised by humans, because otherwise they're going to die. So it's kind of, no scenario is good, but if they're raised by humans, they're not going to be raised the way a gorilla mama would raise them, or a gorilla group of female gorillas would raise the baby. And then they grow up to be not great mothers to their own babies. So this is really sad, and this is just speaks to the intergenerational traumatic cycle of trauma. Females will neglect and abuse their babies, which if they're raised originally by humans, this requires humans to intervene and take the babies and raise them. But because humans make more inadequate raised gorillas, we just continue to go around this cycle of interference with caregiving. Continuity of care. You may have heard this phrase before, you may not have, but it's such an important phrase, and it's very important and relevant to humans as well. So gorillas often get moved around from different zoos and rescues to prevent inbreeding, to prevent siblings from having babies together. And because they're highly social, they're a very highly social species, this makes the female group of gorillas, because remember, they always stay together in a group, continuity of care, they stay together. It destabilizes the group when we're constantly pulling one out and putting them with a new group, constantly pulling one out and moving them to a new group, requiring constant new socialization on a consistent basis. This is not healthy, and this is not the norm in how humans relate to people or how gorillas relate to people. So I want you to take just a minute or two and just think about, how does continuity of care, how does this moving and making people interchangeable in children's lives relate to this concept with the gorillas? Okay. So back to continuity of care. See, there's the whole mama group and then the baby group. And so they're all socializing as a group. When we interfere with that group socialization, we really mess up the whole system. So groups of gorillas raise their young together, and stable groups are better at raising babies. Now think about it. So are moms. Like when we have support and we have littles, it's so nice to have a stable group of friends, family, other people who are also raising babies, so you can be in support of each other. Now imagine if that socialization pattern is disrupted all the time, and you're supposed to have new friends help with your babies all the time. That makes for a lot of anxiety and stress about caregiving. So being a mother, being a mama, is a learned social behavior. It's not just about giving birth, it's actually a learned social behavior. So motherless mothers, meaning mothers that have a baby but they didn't have a mother, are much less likely to be emotionally stable and are not taught proper mothering through a well-functioning social system and structure. Where if in the natural environment, a baby loses their mother, granted, gigantic trauma, but it's the stable, consistent, emotional, social group that protects that baby and keeps the baby socialized so they will be able to grow up and be a well-functioning gorilla. But that's also true for other species as well as humans. Changes from the social norm lead to changes that are referred to as epigenetic mediated social inheritance. That's a lot of hard words, but let's break it down a little bit. Epigenetics, remember, those are the dials that turn up and down the genes, on or off, expressed or not expressed. And it's the environment that mediates that through the social interaction of the group. And this can change the neurodevelopment and the physiological processes within the child, the baby gorilla, whoever it's impacting. It has an impact on all sorts of mammals. And social inheritance, it means that what we do in our social experience helps to create the best way to adapt and survive in that social environment. So we don't want to mess with that too much. Remember the example of people are not interchangeable. That interferes epigenetically long term. It's a social interference with the norm. So if I come home, I'll use the example of a dog or a cat or your pet or your partner or your sibling or your parent. If every single time you came home, you were met with a dog or a cat or a partner or a sibling, but they weren't your person or your pet or your family member, you would be highly stressed and irregular or irregulated about that. So it's very important to recognize that the social influence has a lot of power over how our body and our genes are expressed epigenetically as well. And continuity of care is one of the things that really supports that social inheritance of stability. Continuity of care means that the same people take care of you consistently across a long period of time. Okay, we're going to talk about Harry Harlow again. Remember Dr. Harry Harlow, who did the studies of the rhesus monkeys? And he wanted to sort of quantify the concept of the science of love. And so he studied maternal separation, dependency needs, and social isolation, which are all very traumatizing to look at and watch. So again, I want to give you the warning, this is heavy material. So what his work, though, determined was that caregiving and companionship are critical to social and cognitive development. Remember back in I think module 1, when we were talking about how babies who are left in the nursery without their mamas some of them even died when they just got custodial care, but they didn't have actual social, connected, and cognitive opportunities while they were being cared for. So in Harlow's monkey research, the motherless monkeys, so the ones that were not raised by a mama, at best were neglectful as mamas when they grew up, and at worst were actually abusive to their babies. So having a mother figure, somebody who provides that basis for training to be a mother, if that person isn't there, that gorilla or monkey or whatever mammal we're talking about isn't there, then there's ripe and fertile ground for that baby to grow up and be neglectful and abusive because they don't know. They don't have any social reference for how to be a mama. So the insights here are that child abuse and neglect run in families over several generations. And this is true. We talked about this around intergenerational trauma. The cycles of abuse, they don't stop because we haven't changed the social system for them. Neglect begets neglect. Abuse begets abuse. You kind of get what you got. And that's not how we want it to be. And that's not how it should be or has to be. There are changes in the brain And it's in very specifically particular gene called the NGFG gene. And when this gene changes epigenetically, it deactivates the caregiving response. So that's pretty impressive on one hand, and it's also scary on another hand, because in what we're saying is, yes, we actually can control the ability to be a good caregiver and to cancel the cycle of abuse. We can do that. We can also learn from this research, and it's so powerful, and we should, for the poor monkeys who suffered through it sake, that we build a system where we don't let babies or monkeys or anybody go through this neglected or abused cycle. The same thing happens with rats. So here's the rat model. There's a social inheritance study that shows that stressed out mothers become neglectful mothers because they have epigenetic alterations to that same NGFG gene. So when you're completely overwhelmed, you're like, okay, I just need to block it out. Felt that way before. Lots of mamas feel that way. Lots of parents feel that way. Lots of people feel that way. When we are just overwhelmed with stress, we just want to just block it out. Well, we can't really block out the baby. And so without having an impact epigenetically on their genes, because they have to adapt to this blocking out. So when they took lick-deprived rats, remember rats show their love by, they lick their offspring, and that is what expresses genes, hundreds of genes in their system. Just like in humans, you know, people hold us, talk to us, we make eye contact. All these things are things that activate genes, turn them up or turn them down epigenetically. So when we take the rats that had mothers that didn't lick them or nurse them or cuddle them, and we look at that NGFG gene, we can actually see definitive changes in the gene when we look at it. So we know that the cycle continues based on the level of care. So it gets even more interesting, I think, when we start to combine what we know about these rat studies as well as human hormonal changes. All mammals, just prior to and after giving birth are flooded with hormones, including oxytocin and estrogen. Critical for caregiving. Because if you didn't have oxytocin that makes you fall in love and you didn't have estrogen that makes you willing to care for people, then there's going to be a downside. So remember, estrogen also regulates your mood and impacts your brain development and structure. So there's these little estrogen receptors in your brain, and they're either open or closed. If they're open, then the estrogen can go in and be used. But if they're closed, the estrogen can be there, but it won't get used in the proper way and provide nurturing, loving care by that mama. So estrogen receptors play a critical role in maternal behavior. So we need those estrogen receptors to be open, so when the babies are born, the estrogen that's flooded into the system goes into those estrogen receptors to be used to allow the mama to be a very nurturing, loving, engaged, in love mama to her babies. Now, again, oxytocin is the love hormone. It's the love chemical. So when that comes into play, right at birth, when babies make eye contact, there's dopamine and oxytocin, and there's just this instant falling in love that happens. Maybe you've experienced that before. And that is what happens and what leads to healthy, long-term committed caregiving. So levels of these estrogen receptors are significantly reduced compared to mother rats who were raised by nurturing, high-licking mothers. So depending on the level of nurturing, high-licking mothers provided to their pups, their baby rats, determines whether these receptors are open or whether they're closed. And so the hypothalamus, okay, back here, deep back in there, is critical for maternal behavior. Oxytocin, the love hormone, promotes social attached behaviors. That's what falling in love is, right? Socially attached, connected behaviors. And that comes from the help of oxytocin that says, oh my gosh, you're in love. And combined with estrogen, allows for mamas and humans and other species, mammal species, to do this long-term caregiving job and love it. Because we all know it's hard. Okay. So again, still talking about the hormones and the changes in rats and humans and how they kind of relate to each other, and we can make assumptions about humans based on the research that has so far been done on rats. In a high-licked mother rat, the oxytocin binds to the hypothalamus. So here's where we have the oxytocin, it's there. But if we have a low-licked mother rat, so remember, a not so much nurtured mama, then the estrogen receptors are closed. They will not respond to the elevated levels of estrogen in her body. The response to oxytocin in the hypothalamus is reduced. So the oxytocin's there, but the response to it is lowered. Again, think epigenetic, think lowered. The dial is turned down. This interferes with social connection and attachment to their babies because they can't get the estrogen and they can't get the oxytocin, so they don't connect socially and attach to their babies the way they would if the receptors were open, sucking in that estrogen and activating and using the oxytocin so it feels good and they're able to socially connect. It's really so sad. Okay, I say it's really so sad, but at the same time, I also think that this is so powerful and important for us to use in terms of understanding how we want to engage with our babies in life. Like this really fuels the understanding of so many different concepts, from adverse childhood experiences to resiliency, the ability to overcome adversity, and can lead to much better systems to provide support to families, babies, mamas, and communities. So, all right, when we reduce estrogen receptor genes in female pups, that reduction of estrogen persists into adulthood. They didn't get it at the beginning and they don't produce it later on. So when they become mothers, they're low-licking mothers. They don't lick their pups as much as mama rats who got lots of estrogen. The long-term effect of lick deprived or lick deprivation on the expression of estrogen receptor genes is the epigenetic process. Remember, lick deprived closes them, turns the dial down. So it says, nope, we're not going to take that much in. Okay, methylation. This is the control panel. So the more methylation there is, so the more licking there is, then The more methylation reduces the expression of a gene. All right? The less methylation there is increases the expression of the gene. So in the rat sense, less methylation increases gene expression. So a high licking mama rat has low methylation because that increases the expression of the gene for caregiving, the caregiving genes and the socialization genes. Again, when we look at it, when we think about it like in terms of rubbing alcohol, if you put it in a spray can, it has more alcohol, less water, higher methylation. You know, you've ever sprayed. It's more concentrated. But when you put it in a watered down bottle, there's less alcohol, more water because it's mixed with water, and there's lower methylation. So more or less alcohol reduces or increases the amount of water that's obtained, that's able to be taken in. The volume controls. Okay, I've been talking about these the whole time, and I hope it's coming through clearly. Early caregiving environments set the knob volumes to high or low or neutral, which cause the genes to react differently to the same stressful event. I could be standing here with two other people and a spider could walk up the wall and we could all three have a totally different response to that, right? So that's epigenetics in action. That says that our earliest caregiving environments prep our stress regulating system to a high hyper response system, or to maybe a calm response system, to a medium response system. And those different things also have different levels of activation. Epigenetics. Okay. I'm thinking that you're probably starting to get a real grip on what epigenetics means now. So epigenetic alterations cause long-term changes in the gene regulation system, in the gene's ability to express or not express itself. And that epigenetics, remember, is the environment that this gene is going to land in and be required to survive in. So epigenetic equilibrium. This is the stress response system adapts to help maintain a physiological equilibrium when confronted with challenging events in our environment. So, and ever-changing events in our environment, because lots of different things happen all the time. And so all of our genes have to be dialed in. Think about it. Why do people say dialed in? Because we want equilibrium. And the way we get equilibrium is by altering the expression of anything. We alter the sound knobs, we alter the TV knobs. Well, back in the old days we did, not so much anymore, but whenever we change a dial to balance something out, that's the equilibrium. And here, the stress response system is building a system that can be balanced in the environment in which that person shows up in. And that environment can be strikingly different for different people in different places, in different cities, in different parts of the world, in different geographies, all sorts of things. So the body is doing everything it can in order to make it most likely to survive in the world that it's going to be born into. And early environments completely impact epigenetics. So the stress response system is one way to describe how epigenetics works. and how this concept is critical to our everyday functioning and survival is that our earliest experiences, and even before birth experiences, are determining how our bodies respond to the world. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story about these two rats. They're actually sisters. They're genetically identical. They have the same exact parents, but they're from two different litters. One litter, the mama was fed a high folate crumble for rats, and that's the little brown rat during her litter. But the golden rat, when the mama was pregnant with her litter, was fed just a basic, low nutrition value crumble for that rat. And so when the nutrition was altered in the environment during pregnancy for these rats, it altered their genetic expression in their body of weight gain, their metabolism. It really impacted their metabolism. You can see that the little brown rat has a much more effective metabolism, and the golden rat has a slower metabolism necessary because it has to work harder with what it has because it doesn't have all of the nutrients that it needs. So it actually needs more food in order to get the same level of nutrients. So the expression of the metabolism genes are completely different, even though these two rats are genetically completely identical. And it's all based on what their mamas were fed during their pregnancy. So there's three epigenetic mechanisms that happen. There's the DNA methylation, and then there's these proteins that attach to the DNA in order to read the gene. So it's like needing a decoder. You need a decoder to read the gene. That's the proteins that are there. And a chemical group is added to a specific place on the DNA, like a very specific targeted place, creating a process for methylation. This typically, when there's methylation, remember, it turns the gene off. That stops the gene from reading it. It says, nope, we don't need that gene. And so a chemical group can be removed from DNA the same way. And this is called demethylation, and that turns the gene on. So it's a complicated way still of saying the dialing up or the dialing down. When there's a lot of methylation, the genes are turned off. And when there's not very much methylation, the genes are actually activated and turned on. Okay, epigenetic code. Epigenetic code provides a lot of flexibility and adaptability. All you have to do is look around you and look at all the different people in the world and see how beautiful and diverse we all are. Like, you never run into the same people ever. So we know that there's other things going on besides just genetics. So the epigenetic process allows for particular types of information to be expressed and passed on to offspring without having to go through the very slow process of mutation that happens in evolution that Darwin taught us about, around how the survival of the fittest, that's a very slow process of mutation. However, epigenetics allows for a similar process to happen much more quickly with every single birth. Okay, so here's a great case example of this, and this is also a really sad story, but you can Google this, The Three Identical Strangers. It's a PBS story about three identical twins who were separated at birth. And there's a very interesting, it's just a very interesting story. It's much more about the social interference factors of how people end up expressing themselves in their lives. However, it definitely makes you think about how having genetically identical human beings raised in three completely different environments, the consequences of that happening and the destruction of being removed from each other when they'd shared the womb together forever. So check out this movie, Three Identical Strangers, and enjoy. All right, everybody, that's a wrap. Thanks for watching.